Chapter 16, the Throbbing Heart of News. I was carrying a hatful of eggs in from the barn and saw a man sitting a horse on the hillside back of Roxanna's. This was next morning before full light, and he was perhaps a half-mile from the house, so what I saw was the black shape of him up there. The rider was Davey. I knew it without question. He sat the horse and watched me. The horse was still but for its flapping tail, and as the light improved, we looked at one another across the half-mile of clean blue snow. I was sure it was Davey, yet I wouldn't have been made a fool of, so I looked at the house to see who was watching. Nobody was. I waved. The horseman didn't wave back. He turned and started working round the side of the hill. I could see the plunge and heave of the horse's chest, and the roaming curve of its neck as it struggled through the deep snow. The rider urged it forward, following some upward path. Alarmed lest he leave my sight, I peeled for the house, herded the eggs across the countertop where Swede was waiting to candle them, and churned back outside. Horse and rider were gone. "What's going on?" Swede yelled. She'd followed me and was on the back step in an apron. Roxanna had promised to teach us her great-uncle's cinnamon rolls, those he had served to young Butch Cassidy. "There was a guy on a horse up the hill there," I pointed. Not one to hold back, I'd certainly have claimed it was Davey, except Roxanna appeared in the door to say her neighbor Lonnie Ford pastured cattle on that hill and on others behind it, and kept a trail open during the winter. She had mentioned this Lonnie before, a rancher who preferred to be horseback than at home with his wife, who, according to Roxanna, took little joy in range beeves or the pastoral life in general. Swede said, "We're going to make the rolls. You coming in?" "I'll be just a minute." The door shut. I jogged to the barn as though perhaps I'd forgot something out there, slipped in nonchalantly, and sped through to the back, dislodging hens. I vaulted into the goat pen and banged out the door into the small corral. From here I could trot off toward the hillside in question without being observed from the house. It wasn't that I wholly believed anymore the horseman I'd seen was Davey. You can imagine how my hopes slumped when Roxanna mentioned the rancher Lonnie Ford. But it sure had looked like Davey, even if the distance was great and the light poor and the thinking wishful. If nothing else, I meant to get up to where that horse trail was and follow it a little ways. It was something to do that was real and outdoors and required work. As such, it was also a spontaneous adventure. I could picture how Swede would react later. "You thought it was Davey, and you just took right off after him?" Why, it was like something Davey himself would do. Feeling lively and prideful, I pressed forward. The sun was full out, the field was a glacier, I lifted my eyes to the hills. What a hike, though. While most of the snow had blown into chalky dunes a boy could walk on, in the lee of some drifts lay soft pockets that could drop you waist deep. And then it was a tough slog. Such travel eats time, and I imagined ways my spontaneous adventure might turn out, the better to entertain Swede. Suppose I followed the horse trail to the far side of the hill, and there encountered Lonnie Ford. What would he say to a boy who tracked him so boldly? While Roxanna had described him as middle-aged, I imagined Mr. Ford as young. He'd looked young enough to me that morning, though anyone knows a man looks younger on horseback. It's the effect of the mount on your posture. Even August Schultz shed years when he rode, and placid in nature. I imagined coming on him round the side of the hill, warming his hands over a twig fire, in fact, probably brewing some coffee in a pot up there, not being welcome to do so at home, where his wife sat pining for skyscrapers. I imagined him turning to me, pleased for company, though not the sort of fellow who'd say it in so many words, asking my name, walking over to his patient horse, taking a tin cup from a saddlebag. "Coffee, Reuben?" "Thank you, Mr. Ford. Yes, that'll do." Here I was taken suddenly aback by my own poetic deficiency. Were Swede out adventuring, she'd surely concoct spunkier upshots than a cup of joe with a hen-pecked rancher. I started again. I'd come round the side of the great hill, which I was starting to climb now, to my relief, and there he'd be, the aloof and dark-browed and oft-times terrifying Ford, and stretched before him on the snow would be the corpse of the calf he had come seeking, a corpse ripped open throat to guts, eyes froze, tongue pushed out like the humped beef tongues at Otto Schock's spread owl. And Ford would be kneeling there, fingers touching the perfect blood-borne tracks of a stupendous wolf. A fearful sight. And Ford would turn to me and, "Boy," he'd growl, "what are you doing up here? These hills aren't for wandering on foot. Come look at these prints. As big as my face." Notice, boy. He didn't even eat. He kills for sport, probably. Ford would conjecture, squinting about. Probably's watching us, even now. Well, you can see why Swede was the writer, but I did devise several more such overbig scenes, and they made me happy and killed time until I reached the horse trail, which, once reached, was nothing but the track through drifts of a single long-legged horse, and not the clean footpath I had imagined. I slumped to my haunches. Trail, my eye. It was thigh-deep in snow, and all the worse for the fact that a horse had walked on it, breaking through the crust. The truth is, I nearly cried at this point, for I'd worked so hard to get here, and Mr. Ford had no doubt ridden home by now anyway, and Swede, of all unfairness, was back in Roxanna's kitchen, stirring up cinnamon rolls. I stewed in this distress till my hind end, which had rocked back in the snow, started with that cold ache that's worse for also being soaked. Then, getting up, I looked back at the house and the barn. Well, they were way back there. A very decent stretch considering the terrain, and considering I was a pauper in the lung department. It stirred me up. I clawed snow off the back of my pants. In fact, though I badly wanted to go home and warm up, I now saw that at this height the hill tapered considerably, and that the snow up here looked generally hard swept. It also occurred to me that cinnamon rolls are made with yeast and take a good while to rise. What would it hurt to follow the horse trail as planned? Might not Mr. Ford even now be round that bend, examining the slaughtered calf? I trotted ahead, keeping the trail on my right. From someplace a cow bawled, and the sound rattled across the frozen hills. Practically before realizing it, I come round and was looking down at a valley beyond which rose more and steeper hills, some with barren, stratified cliffs, others with juniper and twisted scrub pine dabbing up from the snow. 20 yards down the trail sat Davey on a stamping bay horse. He looked smaller than a memory and darker than my memory of him. I don't know what I tried to say. I didn't say anything. He looked me over while the horse ducked and steamed and shook its head. He had on a fur cap with ragged long flaps that fell to his chest, and a green army parka so large the sleeves were rolled back. Over his jaw lay a whiskery scrub that erased the boy I might have expected. When I looked at his face, I felt dizzy and fearful, for it was Davy's face, and yet another's also. But my faintness disappeared when he grinned under the hat and chuckled, and nodded the horse forward, saying, "Pretty long climb, wasn't it, Natty Bumpo?" It was hard to talk at first. He walked the horse up and offered me his hand. I took it, and he lifted me up behind him. I sat back of the saddle on the horse's wide rump, a slippery arrangement. I kept tilting one way or the other while we worked down the backside of the hill. It was steeper here, and the horse, name of Fry, kept skidding sideways and catching himself. I leaned forward and grabbed Davy round the ribs. "It's all right, Rube. He's good at this." But to me it was like standing on a steep roof in wind, and I hung on tight. It was such a relief to hold on to my brother again. But it was strange, also. Davy's coat smelled smoky, sulphurish. He was thinner and harder than I remembered. He seemed compressed. He spoke to the horse in quiet, clipped phrases. We bumped and slid and finally angled down to a stand of juniper where the hill leveled out, and there Fry stopped. "You all right?" Davy asked. "Sure thing," I said. "Nice horse," I added, as if I could discern any such thing. "You freezing?" "I'm okay." "Jump off, why don't you?" "Okay." But I monkeyed around quite a bit. The trouble came when I lay bellywise across the horse with both legs hanging down. Then I froze. For once, starting the downslide, there'd be no stopping, and Fry seemed a tall animal. "You're clear, Rube. Slide away," Davy encouraged. "Yep," but I hung tight. I couldn't see my feet, and that was the difficulty. Then Fry lost patience and haunched right, and I slipped down, missed the earth, and lit on my back under Fry. The horse stamped, throwing snow in my eyes. I scrambled to safety as Davy swung down, and then he did grab hold of me like I was his little brother for real, and I hugged him back, clenching all muscles so he'd notice how strong I'd become. The best thing was to hear him laugh, and his laugh was as I remembered, only deeper. Davy always had a lot of bass for his size. "Tell the truth now," he said. "Did you know it was me?" "How'd you know?" "Well, I could just tell. I knew right away, even far away," I fairly spouted. Back on the ground, I was a geyser of joy and vindication. "I saw you up here and knew it was you," I added. It had been my first thought, after all. He didn't have to know about Lonnie Ford. You didn't tell nobody, did you? Why, no. Not that I meant to portray myself as a boy of wisdom and self-restraint, but it felt fine to have Davy admire me, especially after my clumsy landing. Good for you, Rube. Man, I'm glad to see you. The great question suddenly occurred. But how'd you know where we were? I heard you last night, you and Swede fooling around by that coal vein. He perched back on a deadfall pine. Swede doesn't sound like anybody else, you know. I tied Fry and prowled up. You were watching us? He smiled big. But you didn't come out. You should have. Good thing I didn't, wouldn't you say? Davy asked, striking me as silent a moment till I recalled how Martin Anderson had showed up. He said, Rube, who was that guy? So I described the putrid Fed. Though Davy had assumed being the object of pursuit, these were the first particulars he'd heard, and they fascinated him. He wanted a complete portrayal of Anderson. He wanted to know how he spoke, what sorts of things he said, how he treated Swede and me, how he got along with Dad. He got a kick out of Anderson spying on the Airstream in Linton, the way he waved at us, how he saluted driving away. To my great annoyance, Anderson didn't come off as badly in these recountings as I felt he deserved. But Davy didn't mind. He kept nodding and smiling and cracking his knuckles, which reminds me to mention he was still wearing those yellow farm chore gloves he'd had on the previous fall, the day I shot the goose. Where do you live? I asked abruptly. A person can't live outside in the winter with only farm gloves. Come on, Rube. You were saying how you shook him off in Linton. True enough, I'd just been getting to the good part. And when I told about Swede slinking over and emptying the Aunt Jemima down Anderson's tank, Davy laughed so hard he tipped over into the snow, and the horse, Fry, laid back his ears and crunched about stiff-legged. I said, Are you staying around here? He quit laughing and looked me over. Not far away. I'd like to show you where, but I better not. Hey, it's all right. I wasn't getting teary, but it surely wasn't all right. He said, It's better if you don't know, Rube, which sounded, I thought, harshly, like he didn't trust me. I'm no rat fink, I told him with some warmth. Of course not, he agreed. We sat on the dead pine while Fry pawed the snow for browse. It might surprise you, after my longing for details, that I got few from Davy. Always one to withhold the personal, he seemed more than usually constrained, as though we were observed or waiting for some third person to join us. He took off his fur hat and hung it from a branch to sway like an islander's removed head. For some reason, I recalled old Mr. Finch freezing in the wind outside the post office. I felt awful about Mr. Finch and wanted to believe Davy might have too, but I couldn't bring it up without seeming soft, maybe even disloyal, so we talked small a while, which was satisfactory in its way, since we were at least sitting together as in more thoughtless times. Say, Davy wondered, what is it with Dad and that lady? So I told how he'd met Roxanna, a little about her goats and her dad's theater and her great-uncle who had consorted with famous robbers, but I didn't do her justice. For example, I didn't tell how ruinous it had seemed only last night, when we'd been on the brink of departure. Is she liking Dad a lot? Davy asked. I don't know. You saw them, I said cautiously. What did you think? She likes him. Boy, he looks skinny, though. He had pneumonia. He's okay. How about you? How are the lungs? When I thought about it, they were on the poor side. Why don't you come down to Roxanna's? I'll go down first and make sure Anderson's not there or anything. Sweet'll go crazy. Davy smiled at his feet. I guess not, Rube. She's making cinnamon rolls, I said, and in the tone you employ trapping toddlers. Listen, I really want to. You don't know how much. I wouldn't mind meeting Dad's lady friend either, but it sounds like this putrid Fed isn't a dope. He's kind of a dope, I said loyally. Well, he thinks I'm here, and sure enough I am. How do you figure that? It seemed to me like Davy ought to have known. What he said was, somebody saw you. He said you took a pig out of somebody's barn. A couple of pigs. Oh, Davy said. Oh. Like a gentleman, he never suggested that Anderson had simply followed us here. That had we not set out from roofing, he'd have had no call to suspect the Badlands. Word of 2 stolen pigs might have reached the local sheriff, but hardly farther. We sat a minute, and he said, I can't come down, that's all. The truth is, Rube, I'm trying real hard to miss the penitentiary. I couldn't blame him. I still don't. But it put me back in a hard spot. What am I supposed to say, then, when I get back? Nothing. He looked at me so alarmed I recognized my idiocy. Don't tell Dad, and especially don't tell Swede. Goodness sakes, Reuben. Okay, but I couldn't imagine going back and not telling Swede at least. I wasn't even sure it was possible. Rube, Davy said, honestly, I can't talk to Dad right now. How come? Fry was champing about something and Davy stood to soothe him. At this moment a clutch of crows that had gathered overhead all decided to move on and did so, tutting and cawing. My guts went eerie. In movies, this is where you look around for the creeping posse. Davy said, You know what? I didn't steal Fry. It seemed an odd jump. I wouldn't have cared if he had. He belongs to a friend of mine, a fellow who's helped me out. This sounded like good news. Somebody on our side. A rancher? Is it Lonnie Ford? Nope, no rancher. He wished to laugh here, I could see, but was held to a smile. This man's in some trouble. Real trouble, Reuben. He's been all right to me, though. Davy stroked the nervous Fry, who continued to blow and push at his shoulder. The horse's fretfulness was transmissive, and my brother seemed to go up on edge. He quit talking to peek here and there. He listened, not as you might listen for the bloodhound, I now suspect, but as for a distant summons, as we listen sometimes, roaming in the timber, expecting to be whistled down for supper. I knew our visit was about over, and in panic yanked open every drawer in my brain for a way to prolong it. Davy said, It's a long walk back for you. Here, I'll take you part way. He was in the middle. He was in the saddle before I could reply, seizing my hand, hoisting me up. Fry moved out of the trees without urging and headed back up the hill. I said, What's your friend's name? Nothing right away, then, Walter. Walter what? No, Waltzer. Last name's Waltzer. First is Jape Waltzer. Jape? Funny name. He didn't reply. The horse angled up the hill, his front heaving and rearing, so I had to grip Davy even tighter than previously. The whole valley was sunstruck. The day had only grown lovelier, yet I could feel brightness leaching away from me. Doubt crouched in the snow all around. A horrid picture arose in obscure colors of Davy lying dead in a dark place, never to be discovered. It shot through me that I would not see him again, that the horse with every upward plunge bore us nearer a ruthless parting I was bound to keep secret. My breathing turned thick, a feather pillow ruptured inside. Dad came to mind, and miracles, and I shut my eyes and prayed that when we came round the hillside, he would by divine leading be standing there waiting for us, his face primed with wisdom and responsibility. I believed in this picture as hard as possible, given the short time and Fry's jerky gait. Oh, if it could happen in this way, I'd run home atop the softest snow. So quick would be my feet, I'd shout the whole way there, so regenerate my lungs. We reached the place where Davy picked me up and went farther round until Roxanna's place came into view. Davy said, Whoa, Fry. Rube, you better walk the rest. But I didn't let loose of him. How could I, burdened as I was? Rube, I have to tell somebody about you, I said. Boy, it sounded like whining. He pried my arms away and turned in the saddle. You can't do it, Reuben. Not yet. You understand. But I wouldn't acknowledge this injunction. In fact, I wouldn't look him in the eyes. I'd never defied Davy before, and it shamed me to be doing so now. It violated the larger order. In panic, I recognized that without prompt staving, I would weep. Then show me where you live, I said. Rube, I told you, it's better you don't know. Under my knees, Fry shifted, and I had to grab the cantle to stay aboard. I said, Show me, or I'll tell Dad. So I was a rat fink, after all. No doubt this was a fink-like threat. Yet who was I to bear sole knowledge of my brother's whereabouts? Did I ever claim to be Mr. Atlas, or anybody close? I hung to the cantle and watched Davy consider what I'd said, all the while with the miserable sensation of having wrecked something. But then he nodded. All right, Rube. Okay. So stunned was I to have prevailed in this that I let go my grip, and Fry took a step and tumbled right down in the snow. We have to get you some practice, Davy muttered as I whacked myself clean. Help me up, I said. Already I was picturing Davy and this Walter living in some kind of wigwam or teepee, smoke coming out of the top. I couldn't wait to see. Not now. But you said tonight, he leaned toward me. I'm not taking you down there cold. I have to tell Jape you're coming. Something in the timbre of his voice convinced me this was the proper thing. He said, "Can you get out of the house without rousting everybody?" Yes, of course I could. I'd read as much Twain as the next boy. Davy studied Roxanna's place. "Come out back of the barn. Walk straight this way, at least a couple 100 yards. I'll be close." He turned Fry, who frisked the first few steps as though glad to be rid of me. "Wait, what time? When should I come out?" "When you can," he called without looking back. "I'll be there. I got no other plans." Something was missing when I got back to Roxanna's. Coming in the back, I hung my coat, unbuckled my overshoes, and tossed them in the corner to gape. "Hello," I yelled. The house was quiet. "Was there ever a place you loved to go, your grandma's house, where you were a favorite child, and you arrived there once as she lay in sickness? Remember how the light seemed wrong and the adults off-key, and the ambient and persistent joy you'd grown to expect in that place was gone, slipped off as the ghost slips the body?" Yet the feeling eased as I entered the kitchen, for the cinnamon rolls had just come out with their beguiling aroma, and Swede was busy whisking up frosting. "Well, where'd you go?" she asked. "Just a walk. Sorry I missed breakfast." "You could have told somebody." "Boy, Swede!" I really was sorry. My dread returned. Hungry all as I was, the rolls didn't appeal. I looked in the barn and all over. I just hiked around a little. Never was I more determined to keep a secret. Shouldn't slip. Tonight was sure to fail. She said, "Were you looking for Dad?" "No. Isn't he here?" "Of course not," Swede reported. "He went out driving with Mr. Anderson." "The last thing you'd expect, right? Me too." "Well, it's true. He got up before daylight and left." She tested the frosting, picked the coffee pot off the stove, poured a splash in the bowl, and began to flail. I sat down. The truth is my lungs felt congealed. I was so tired, my hands seemed disconnected, propped on my knees way down there. I said, "Where's Roxanna?" "She's got a customer." "How come he went?" Swede punished the frosting. No doubt she'd have been happier had an answer been available. "How come he wants to help that guy? He wants them to catch Davey now?" Of course I was hoping for some refutation here. For Swede to defend Dad's strange decision to accompany the putrid Fed, that was my careful word. Accompany. As opposed to join, assist, side with. Then I thought of something else. What about the spookism? This actually shook me up the worst. He said it was spookism. He wouldn't go along with that, Swede. She still didn't reply. Out front we heard Roxanna enter their house with her customer. Some happy gas bag slapping money on the counter. We heard the slide of the cash drawer, a goat bleat, the bell ding above the door. Then Roxanna swept into the kitchen, her eyes bright from the wind. "Reuben," she exclaimed, "where'd you go?" And she came and kissed my cheek. First time she ever did so. "Exploring." "That's good. Find anything?" She was off, hanging up her coat. Swede was preparing to frost the rolls, having beaten the stuff to paste. At this moment I wanted enormously to tell them about Davey. That would change the color round here. Knowing I couldn't made me sore. I yelled out, "Roxanna, how come Dad went?" She came out of the mudroom and took the chair next to me. I remember she was wearing a deep green sweater with a high cowl neck, and I remember how she put her elbows on her knees to look in my eyes. "He felt he had to go, Reuben. He didn't want you to be angry about it." "But how come?" She measured me for a beat or two. "He was led to go." "Led?" This was supposed to mean the Lord was in charge and paving your way, such as letting you get fired so you'll be free to leave town, or sending you an airstream so you can go in comfort. Dad knew something about being led, I realized, yet this I could not buy. Led by who? That barf, Mr. Anderson? Roxanna turned briskly aside as if deflecting my vulgarity. For a moment she seemed unable to look at me. When she did, her eyes were so merry I was stumped indeed. She said, "I don't think Mr. Anderson could influence your father to clear his throat." "But he went with him. Reuben, he stayed up all night. I woke and heard him. Do you know what he was doing?" "I suppose praying," I answered miserably. "Yes, not like I ever heard anybody pray." Roxanna stopped there, still not knowing what to say about it. I noted here a deep and elegant blush accompanying her search for words. "I got up," she added, "and we talked a while. Swede, don't you think that frosting's a little thick?" It sure was. stuck to the spoon in a fist-sized gob. Roxanna showed her to thin it with coffee and a little warm butter. How we hate waiting for things to make sense. For I can tell you now what Roxanna held back at the time. How she woke to the sound of Dad's voice raised to the pitch of argument. How she thought at first that Anderson himself had come in the night, and the two of them were having it out. Creeping from her room, she heard Dad articulating grievance against the putrid fed. She discerned adjectives, arrogant and foolish, among others. Yet there was no reply. She listened to Dad pacing in his agitation. Sometimes he spoke. At intervals, Roxanna heard him savagely racing through King James, as if to back up some contention. "He doesn't know you and doesn't want to," Dad said, gasping then as though taking a blow. At this, Roxanna covered her mouth, for it occurred to her with whom he wrestled. Having long ago accepted the fact of God, Roxanna had not conceived of going toe-to-toe with him over any particular concern. "Make me willing if you can," Dad cried, a challenge it still shakes me to think of. What Roxanna heard next was a tumble like a man thrown. She'd have rushed in then, but her muscles went weak and she sat down in the hall at her bedroom door. She remembers yet the strange warmth that comforted her there. In fact, she fell asleep with her back against the wall, even as chairs tipped and Dad strove in the other room. Waking some time later, she rose without stiffness and found him at the kitchen table. He was at peace, his Bible closed, though his underwear shirt was torn across the chest. He smiled at her. He asked for coffee. When he stood, he held to the back of a chair. But Roxanna didn't tell us all this at the time. All she said was, Dad was praying in the night, in great distress over the Anderson problem, and she got up to keep him company, and their talk ranged far and wide. "He told me how you took down that corn crib," Roxanna said. "He's pleased how strong you're getting. I figured she was trying to win my pardon for Dad. That wasn't so hard. And then buying groceries with the money," she added. "I wanted a canoe." "He really did," Sweet affirmed. "Well, maybe you'd reach down 3 plates," said Roxanna, "and get out the milk." As I did, she said, "Buying those groceries instead of the canoe? It broke your heart, I bet." "At first," I admitted. Would you say," she wondered, "that you were led to do that?" I saw what she was getting at, but it only needled me, as the honest point so often does. "Well, sure, led by Sweet," I groused. "That's her job, isn't it?" Which drew Roxanna's low, beautiful laugh. "Come on, Reuben," she said. "Come tell me if these rolls are as good as Mr. Cassidy thought they were." He actually didn't die in Bolivia like everyone believed. Butch Cassidy. He died, Roxanna claimed, near the wind-blown hamlet of Reese, Kansas, in 1936. She knew because the outlaw had reappeared in her great-uncle's doorway in Casper around the beginning of the First World War. Howard Colley had received an officer's commission, his skills as both gunsmith and doctor making him alluring to the U.S. Army. He was packed and sitting at the kitchen table, rolling cigarettes, when Cassidy banged on the door. Though sporting a limp and a cane, he retained the vitality that had so won Howard over. Nope, he hadn't been shot in the famed cantina. He got the limp when an embittered horse rubbed him off on a cottonwood tree. The poor fellows in the cantina? Friends of his, God rest their souls, 2 boys, Mark and Pugger, who'd ridden down from California to be vaqueros. It had been advantageous to a Bolivian lieutenant named Jarvey to believe and report he had killed the notorious American badman, when in fact the dead were mere apprentices. But Butch and Harry Longbot weren't even in Bolivia at the time. They were riding south through Argentina to meet with an American genius, expatriate like themselves, who claimed to have constructed a balloon in which a man could circle the world. Longabaugh had some idea of investing in the genius's proposed expedition. To what likely profit Butch never divined. Butch only went along, thinking he might get a balloon ride. Swede, during this, had been perched edgewise, waiting to jump in. "I knew he didn't get shot in Bolivia. It was a lie the whole time." Yes, you can imagine how it pleased Uncle Howard. He felt bad about not offering Butch better hospitality, but he got his commission, and the train was imminent, said Swede. Yes, there was no question of his not going, Roxanna said, though she added how her great-uncle, when old and stove up, confided that he'd come about one whisker from chucking the U.S. Army and going off with Cassidy, and likely would have done it had Butch said the word. He should have, said Swede. And that was the last time Howard saw his friend. Cassidy confided he was taking a new name, Jonas Work, because he liked the honest sound of it. He told Howard to look him up when the war ended, possibly in Kansas, where he planned to enter the windmill business. Cassidy's eyes were lit. He loved windmills, loved to watch them spin. Howard believed earnest, but incapable of commencing the honest life. He said, "Good luck, Butch." "Jonas," Butch replied. "Well, wouldn't you agree exclusivity is the throbbing heart of news? Who else in the world knew the real ending to that story? Who knew of poor Mark and Pugger, of ambitious Jarvey? We swelled up large with privileged facts. Think of standing alone on the beach when the shipwrecked survivor slogs ashore with his great tale. Think of uncovering among your papers proof you are the clandestine, long-sought heir of something." "But he died in 36? Swede inquired. Roxanna rose smiling, went to a glass-front barrister, and brought out a scrapbook. It had burgundy covers and black pages bound with ribband, and it creaked when she laid it open. "This came to Uncle Howard in the mail." The sender remained nameless. Jonas R. Work. In Reese, Kansas, on the 9th of October, 1936, at 7 o'clock in the morning, died Jonas Robert Work, esteemed by his community and honored by his country. Mr. Work was 53 years of age. Providence had bestowed on him a firm constitution and strong powers of mind. He was a veteran of the Great War and a member of the celebrated Flying Corps in Lyon. After some dozens of missions, his craft was struck by rifle fire. Mr. Work landed safely, but was captured and held in Prussian stockade, bearing in his left thigh a bullet which would forever impair his stride. After some months, he escaped at great peril to his life and returned alone to friendly soil. Mr. Work arrived in Reese in spring of 1918, having received an honorable discharge and decorations appropriate to his heroism. He entered straightway on a career in business with the Aeromatter Windmill Company, for whom he was a sales representative. It may be confidently said that the majority of windmills standing in Reese, as well as many in the surrounding Flint Hills, were sold and installed by Mr. Work. He was known as expert in locating water in this capacity and was internationally sought. Thus he traveled from Kansas to various parts of the world, returning always with a fund of adventurous tales to instruct and amuse the flock of youngsters who were welcome visitors at his veranda. On the morning of his death, he was completing repairs to a windmill at the Howell Watts Ranch. Though Mr. Work climbed to the mill with his usual geniality, Mrs. Watts, in her kitchen, perceived his shout, peered from the window, and beheld Mr. Work lying at the foot of the tower. She reported that though his pulse stopped within 10 minutes of the fall, the muscular powers of his limbs remained in force for 8 to 10 hours afterward. Such was the power of his constitution. A member of Grace Baptist Church in Reese, Mr. Work died in the hope and faith of his Redeemer. We supposed over that obituary for most of the day, Swede and I, mostly Swede, whose vaulting imagination revealed mine as miserly and torpid. When I supposed it was Longabaugh himself who mailed the clipping to Uncle Howard, she said no, it was probably Longabaugh's valiant sweetheart, Etta, who'd caught leprosy in Bolivia and spent her remaining years alone in a shadowy house writing sensational novels undiscovered to this day. When I credited Butch's water-witching acclaim to using a forked stick cut from a hanging tree, Swede pointed out such sticks only worked that were cut from a tree on which an innocent man had hung, all of which was beside the point anyway, since Butch's yearly trips abroad were no water-locating expeditions, but merry reunions with Harry Longabaugh, the two of them playing mischief with European railroads and financial institutions and bathrobed polygamous sheiks. One more. When I supposed Butch's glee at inventing a glorious military reason for his gimpy leg, Swede reversed herself and suggested it was no invention whatever, that he really had joined the army, gimp and all, piloted a frail Jenny over the German lines, and been shot down and imprisoned and escaped. He always did want to fly, she said. Remember the expatriate balloonist? What about his limbs, I asked. That part about his limbs still being strong after he died was creepy. Well, it's not like he got up and was walking around, Swede said. He could have. Chickens do sometimes. Please, Reuben, she replied, exasperated at this disrespectful likening. People would have fainted. She considered the matter. I suppose he just did a few sit-ups out there by the windmill. Butch probably did sit-ups every day. He was a little vain about his physique. When I thought about it, a dead fellow doing sit-ups in your yard might make you faint just as handily as one strolling. I imagined Mrs. Watts running out to help poor Jonas work, feeling in vain for his pulse. Probably she was weeping at his side when he started sitting up. Probably she thought he was all right. At first, anyway. How many sit-ups do you suppose he did, I wondered. Well, it says his muscles were enforced for 8 to 10 hours. In that case, he was probably still at it when Mr. Watts came in off the pasture. I imagined him coming through the front door all tired out. "Honey," he'd have said, "what do you suppose Jonas is doing out there?" 8 to 10 hours. Boy, that was an awful lot of sit-ups.